when a woman calls the police to remove me from the pool. But the result is truly surprising. On a scorching summer afternoon in Atlanta, I was enjoying a relaxing moment by my very own pool. This space was something I had invested a lot into, hoping for peaceful moments of relaxation. But then, a strange woman showed up, and my life was immediately turned upside down. Stay tuned to find out what happened next. The unexpected poolside incident, a lesson in privilege and assumptions. Summer in Atlanta is relentless. The heat is sweltering, the air heavy with humidity, and the sun blazes down without mercy. For many, the only refuge from this unyielding climate is the cool, refreshing embrace of a pool. That's exactly what I was seeking one lazy afternoon when I decided to take a dip in my very own backyard oasis. When I bought my house a year ago, I envisioned peaceful afternoons spent lounging by the pool, perhaps sipping a mojito and feeling the warm sun on my face. It was an investment I had worked hard for, both in terms of money and time. I didn't just want a house. I wanted a sanctuary, and that pool was a symbol of my success, my hard work, and my ability to create a little slice of tranquility in an otherwise chaotic world. It was a typical summer day. The pool was perfectly clear, the water glistened like liquid sapphire, and I was in my usual spot, floating lazily on a pool float, soaking up the sun, and enjoying the silence. The only sound was the gentle splash of water as I moved my arms through it, the occasional chirping of birds, and the faint hum of a distant lawnmower. The kind of day you imagine when you think of paradise. But then she showed up. At first, I didn't think much of it. A woman had appeared at the gate, standing at the edge of my property, peering over the fence. She was dressed in an all-too-familiar, yet somehow out-of-place, outfit, big sunglasses, bright, bold clothes, and a demeanor that practically screamed, "I'm in charge." Now, I'm no expert in body language, but there was something about the way she stood there, hands on hips, that made me feel like I was about to be scolded for something I hadn't even done. As she raised her voice, I could hear the sharp, entitled tone in her words. "Excuse me, are you aware that this is a private community?" she yelled, her voice carrying over the iron fence and floating across the pool, instantly cutting through the peace I had been enjoying. I blinked, trying to make sense of what she had just said. What is she talking about? I thought to myself, mildly irritated. I floated closer to the edge of the pool, adjusted my goggles, and replied in a calm tone, "Yes, I am. I own this house, and this is my pool." It was then that her face contorted, like she had bitten into a lemon. "Well, I've never seen you before, and I certainly don't recognize you as a resident. I think you need to leave immediately." In that moment, I could feel the heat rising in my chest, the mojito buzz that had once made everything feel light and breezy, slowly fading into a simmering anger. This was my pool, my sanctuary, and yet this woman, this stranger, was standing outside, dictating what I could and couldn't do in my own home. But here's the thing, this wasn't just about a pool. It wasn't even about whether she had a right to be angry or not. This moment, this confrontation, was about something much deeper. It was about privilege, assumptions, and the way people like her believe they have the right to control the lives of others, based purely on their own perceptions. What I didn't know at the time, but soon discovered, was that this would not just be an argument over my right to relax in my own backyard. No, this was going to be a full-on power struggle, and I wasn't backing down. As Mildred, the woman at the gate, continued her rant about how I had no right to be there, I tried to keep my cool. I tried to explain calmly that I lived here, that I had the mortgage and the paperwork to prove it. But it didn't matter. She wasn't listening. And then, things took a turn for the worse. Her secret weapon appeared. A man, likely her son, who looked remarkably like a younger, slightly less angry version of her. He lumbered up beside her, flexing muscles that looked like they hadn't seen a gym in years. But it wasn't his physical appearance that caught my attention. It was the fact that he was followed by a man in a police uniform. Now, at this point, I'll admit I felt a jolt of panic. A police officer? What did they have to do with this? Had I somehow broken some rule without knowing it? The fear crept in, but I didn't let it show. "This is my son Chad," Mildred announced with a puffed-up chest, as though that somehow made her authority unquestionable. "And this is Officer Friendly. Officer Thompson here to assist us." I couldn't help but notice the subtle but dismissive way Officer Thompson greeted me. He didn't offer any introduction. No "good afternoon" or "how can I help you?" No, it was more of a disinterested nod, as if I was the one who was out of place, not the woman standing outside my house making baseless accusations. "Ma'am, Mrs. McMillan has raised concerns about an unauthorized individual using a private pool," he said, the words dripping with a condescending tone. "Can you please provide identification?" I felt my blood pressure spike, but I kept my voice steady. "Officer, I live here. I have my driver's license inside. Can we go inside so I can retrieve it?" But before he could respond, Mildred cut in. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. She's probably broken in," she screeched. "Officer, I demand you remove her now." And that, my friends, was when I realized this wasn't just an argument anymore. This was a full-on attack. What I hadn't anticipated, however, was how things would escalate. The moment I stepped out of the pool to retrieve my identification, everything spiraled. Mildred's demand for Chad to get her out of my pool was met with an awkward hesitation from him. But it wasn't just Chad's reluctance that threw me off. It was the sheer entitlement in Mildred's actions that really struck me. As she launched herself into the pool, I realized this was no longer about what was right or wrong. This was about a battle of wills, and I was determined to stand my ground. But what happened next was something that left me dumbfounded. It was something I could never have predicted. Stay tuned for part 2 of this story, where the situation takes an even more unexpected turn. The escalation, a battle of wills, and the breaking point. As I stood at the edge of the pool, dripping wet and still in shock, I could feel the tension building around me. Mildred, her face contorted with rage, was not backing down. Her sense of entitlement, already outrageous, now seemed to fuel an uncontrollable fire. She wasn't just confronting me anymore. She was determined to evict me from my own property. And that's when things got really strange. Chad, her son, had reluctantly dipped his foot into the pool, his entire body language screaming that he would rather be anywhere else. He glanced over at me, then back at his mother, clearly caught in an emotional tug-of-war. "Mom, I really don't think this is a good idea," he muttered, his voice quiet, almost apologetic. But Mildred wasn't hearing any of it. With a determined scowl, she barked at him. "Chad, don't you embarrass me in front of the officer. Get her out of there now." And that was when I understood. This wasn't just about my right to enjoy a swim. This was about a woman who had lived her entire life believing that people like her had the power to dictate the actions of others. Power and control were her weapons, and she wasn't afraid to wield them. I watched as Chad sighed deeply, clearly frustrated with his mother's actions, but also clearly unwilling to challenge her. He hesitated again, and for a moment I thought maybe, just maybe, he might stand up for what was right. But instead, he meekly approached the pool, his eyes glancing nervously at me. I couldn't let this go on. Mildred's voice shrieked again. "Chad, are you going to stand there all day?" Her fury was palpable, and it was clear that she was going to take matters into her own hands if Chad didn't comply. And so, to my horror, she did. With a surprising burst of speed for a woman of her age, she launched herself into the pool. The force of her dive created a massive splash that soaked Chad from head to toe, and for a moment, I couldn't help but stifle a laugh at the sight of his stunned expression. But that brief moment of humor quickly evaporated as she turned her attention back to me. I wasn't prepared for what came next. She lunged at me. Mildred's manicured nails shot forward like claws, her grip locking onto my arm with surprising strength. Her face was red with anger as she screamed, "Get out of my pool! This is private property." I recoiled instinctively, trying to push her away without hurting her. This wasn't just an uncomfortable situation anymore. This was a physical confrontation. The shock of the situation left me frozen for a brief second, but as soon as I regained my bearings, I fought back. "Stop! You're going to hurt yourself," I shouted, my voice rising in an attempt to reason with her. But there was no reasoning with someone who had crossed the line between entitlement and outright aggression. It felt like I was in one of those wild action movies, where the hero and the villain lock in an intense battle over control. Except in this case, I wasn't the villain and Mildred wasn't the hero. She was the antagonist, and I had no intention of letting her win. She tugged at my arm, pulling me toward the shallow end of the pool, her grip tightening. I stumbled, barely managing to keep my balance as the water splashed around us. My heart raced, but I was determined to regain control of the situation. And just as I was about to lose my footing, a new voice rang out, cutting through the chaos. "That's enough, Mrs. McMillan." It was Officer Thompson, who had been standing by, observing the entire scene unfold with an expression of disbelief. I could see the discomfort in his face, but instead of taking action earlier, he had remained on the sidelines, letting the situation escalate. Mildred didn't even flinch at the officer's command. Her mind was already set, and she wasn't going to back down. But when Officer Thompson raised his voice again, his tone firm and sharp, she finally loosened her grip on me, if only for a moment. But instead of being relieved, I felt a surge of disappointment. This officer, the one I had hoped would intervene and defuse the situation, was now making me feel like the one in the wrong. "Mildred, that's enough. Let her go," Officer Thompson repeated, his voice louder and more assertive this time. For a moment, I thought I might get away from this confrontation unscathed. But the unease in the pit of my stomach told me otherwise. There was more to come. As I scrambled to escape Mildred's iron grip, I couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. This was no longer about a simple misunderstanding or a poolside disagreement. This was about power, authority, and the pervasive feeling that some people believe they can control others, simply because they assume they have the right. I pulled myself out of the pool, dripping and furious. This wasn't just about a woman who didn't recognize me in the neighborhood. This was about everything I had worked for. The house, the pool, the life I had carefully built for myself. And the more I thought about it, the angrier I became. I had to take a stand. Officer Thompson looked at me, a mixture of awkwardness and confusion on his face. "Ma'am, I understand this is difficult, but Mrs. McMillan has raised valid concerns. I need to verify that you live here. Please, can you provide identification?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. The audacity of this situation was growing more and more ridiculous. She just tried to drag me out of my own pool. I nearly shouted, the disbelief in my voice evident. "And you're taking her side? Are you serious?" His response was mechanical, the words not helping to ease the frustration building in my chest. "I just need to verify your identity, ma'am." But this wasn't just about verification anymore. This wasn't about showing my ID to some indifferent officer. This was a matter of respect, dignity, and my right to feel safe and welcome in my own home. That's when I decided I had enough. I wasn't going to play the part of a passive victim. I wasn't going to let Mildred's entitlement and Officer Thompson's indifference define how I responded. I took a deep breath, steadied myself, and made a bold move. "Before I provide you with any identification," I said, my voice calm but unwavering, "I need to ask you a question." Officer Thompson blinked in surprise. "What would that be, ma'am?" I locked eyes with him. "May I see your badge?" His brow furrowed in confusion. "My badge? What for?" "Just show it to me, please," I insisted, refusing to back down. He hesitated, but eventually, he pulled out his badge, the metal tarnished and worn. I examined it closely, and something wasn't right. The font seemed off. The edges looked too smooth, like it had been mass-produced rather than the official badges I was accustomed to seeing. My suspicions were confirmed. I handed the badge back to him. "Now, I have another question. What precinct are you assigned to?" He shifted awkwardly, looking everywhere but at me. This wasn't looking good. "That's not really relevant, ma'am," he mumbled, but I wouldn't let it slide. "It is relevant. Answer the question." His gaze darted around nervously. "Precinct 6, he muttered, almost too quietly to hear. I nodded slowly, my heart pounding. "And your badge number?" He stammered, trying to regain composure. It's 47B32. Now I was certain. This was not a real officer. "Thank you, Officer Thompson," I said, my voice steady, but my mind racing. "I appreciate your cooperation." And that's when I took action. I pulled out my phone, my fingers trembling slightly as I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency?" the dispatcher asked. "I need to report a fraudulent police officer," I said, my voice shaking with both fear and determination. "His name is Thompson, badge number 47B32, and he claims to be from Precinct 6. I believe he's impersonating law enforcement." The dispatcher reassured me that real officers were on their way.